Hi, welcome back to Navigating Health with Pacific Islander Communities, a learning course with the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. Again, my name is Alisi Tulua, and welcome to Module 6, which is the last module of this learning course. This module, being our last one, is going to touch on some of the current efforts in the community by Pacific Islander organizations to address health disparities that exist in the community. What I hope to achieve in this module is that there is increased knowledge about current efforts in Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander health, and also increased understanding on partnering with the community in moving towards health equity. Thank you for making it this far in the learning course. I hope that by the end of this, you will have a more complete understanding of Pacific Islander health. So just to do a little quick review of what we've covered so far. We started with Module 1, which talked about who Pacific Islanders are and where they come from, where are their homelands and their origins are from. And then we talked about the culture of Pacific Islanders and the values that are common across the different cultures. And then in Module 3, we talked about some of the historical context of many of our different Pacific Islands, especially since some of our Pacific Islands have formal relationships with the United States. And it also provided some context for some of the health outcomes that currently exist in the community. And then in Module 4, I talked about where Pacific Islanders have settled here in the United States and the kind of environment that they're in and how their health is impacted by those environments. And then Module 5, which was the previous one, I shared some of the current health data that we were able to gather to share some of where the community is in terms of health. I think it was pretty clear after everything that has been built up that the health outcomes there are a lot of health disparities that exist in the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this learning course. So with that conversation it leads into what we're covering today, which is what is happening in the community to address some of the health disparities. And so I hope to be able to share today about some of the organizations that are out there. Of course, today is just kind of an overview of some of the organizations. And I'm going to be highlighting some of the ones that have been around and have been doing health disparities work in the community. However, there are way more that I won't be able to cover in this module, but I hope that it is just planting the seed for your own curiosity about learning more and finding out about our different organizations and the kind of work that they're doing to address health issues for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. Before I go into talking about some of our organizations, I just want to ground this very last module in this Tongan proverb, hokope fau moi fau, which means to continue and extend the excellence laid by another that came before. So just a little bit of background on this proverb. So fau is the hibiscus bark. When it is dried, it's usually it's utilized as string or twine of some sort, and it's really resilient. It holds up when it's wet, and then even when it dries, it still holds up pretty well. And in the olden days, it is what was used to make fishing nets, which is why this picture is here. And so this proverb is usually it's a remark that's made to explain times when someone is as successful at something as the person that came before them, or as somebody that came before them. And the reason why I'm using this proverb before I go on to talk about some of our wonderful organizations, is that given everything that we have learned over the last 5 modules, it's clear to see that health is one of the struggles that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have, especially for Pacific Islanders being in this country. And I think, in past modules, I talked about the disparities that are facing our Native Hawaiian community on their own land in Hawaii. So I share this because although it may seem like a huge undertaking, and it is, I hope that as a community, we remember the stock that we come from, the ancestors that we come from, who were master navigators and faced many unknowns and were able to find destinations and build civilizations and build cultures that existed for thousands and thousands of years. And so I hope that the work that is happening in the community in this country is an extension of the excellence of our ancestors that existed before us, that we remember to continue to uphold that level of commitment and that level of love and level of connectedness to each other as a community, because we have been navigators before and we continue to be navigators. And so I hope that as we continue to think about the work we're doing as a community, that we remember that we are an extension of excellence that existed before. And so it is part of our responsibility to continue to uphold that so that future generations can continue to build upon it. Okay, so with that, we're just going to start in Hawaii since, Native Hawaiians are part of our Pacific Islander community, and seeing as they are indigenous to this country since Hawaii is a state, I want to just start the journey there. And one of the beacons in the work in Hawaii is Papa Ola Lokahi. And Papa Ola Lokahi does a wide range of different kinds of work, from direct service all the way up to policy advocacy, research, and their work is really focused on Native Hawaiian populations. However, they also serve other communities as is requested of them. Their executive director is Dr. Sherry Ann Daniels. Their website is here on this slide. And, their mission is to improve the health status and well-being of Native Hawaiians and others by advocating for initiating and maintaining culturally appropriate strategic actions aimed at improving the physical, mental, and spiritual health of Native Hawaiians and their ohana, and empowering them to determine their own destinies. One really beautiful thing that I've learned over these past months in my interaction with a lot of our organizations in Hawaii is this draw towards re-centering indigenous practices, and how much that aligns with so many of the people that are doing work, especially around health, serving Native Hawaiian communities. And it's really inspiring to see them do that in Hawaii on their own land. It is the closest that that any of us can get to being able to practice our traditions and cultures on our ancestors' lands. And so, I hope that kind of work, that level of work continues to grow, especially for our Native Hawaiian community. Of course, I'm highlighting Papa Ola Lokahi, but there are a lot of other organizations in Hawaii serving the Native Hawaiian community. And there's a group of organizations that I also want to mention that are federally qualified health clinics or health centers that are throughout the different islands of Hawaii that serve the community in many different capacities. And so I didn't create a whole list of them, but there are a lot of them that are sprinkled throughout the different islands who serve to build more thriving and healthy Native Hawaiian communities. The other organization that I want to talk about that is out of Hawaii is We Are Oceania. And We Are Oceania is led by their executive director, Jocelyn Howard, who is Micronesian. This organization is about empowering our Micronesian community to navigate success while honoring the integrity of our diverse heritage. I hope that you remember some of the challenges that I talked about in previous modules that many of our Micronesian communities face. And so this organization in Hawaii exists to serve the Micronesian and Pacific Island communities through the state, and is aimed at centralizing the support system of all Micronesian communities, families, and individuals in Hawaii. Okay, so from Hawaii, I want to touch on a few of our national organizations. These are entities that serve the community, but at the national level, and for the most part, do a lot of convening of different organizations around specific issues, or serve as advocacy organizations at the federal level, and really just connecting the community to what is happening usually at the federal level. And so three of our main national organizations are PICOPSI, which stands for Pacific Islander Center of Primary Care Excellence. It was established to improve the health of Pacific Islanders in the United States and the U.S. Pacific through primary care support, research, workforce development, and community initiatives. PICOPSI is led by, I'm just guessing here based on my own familiarity. I think PICOPSI is co-led by Dr. Nia Aitato as research lead, I believe, and Dr. Reynald Samoa as the clinical lead. PICOPSI is the organization that holds and hosts the National Pacific Islander COVID-19 response team, who was really instrumental in gathering the community, organizing the community, and really getting the work started at the beginning of the pandemic to respond to COVID-19. This is PICOPSI has been around for a few years, and so there's still a lot of area of work that they are building up towards. So it's really exciting to see the growth from the work that they're doing at the national level. The other organization is Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, EPIC. Their executive director is Tawai Samuelu, and EPIC's mission is to promote social justice by engaging Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities through culturally relevant advocacy, research, and leadership development. EPIC has been doing a lot of great work at the national level, really building awareness for federal agencies, connecting the community to issues and decision-making and policy-making that's happening at that level, and really has been instrumental in being able to compile data reports that have been really useful for the community over the past years. So that's EPIC. They do national level work. Based out of LA. This is their website. And then last but not least, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Alliance. Their executive director is Kiawan Young. NHPI Alliance is an organization that was started by a gathering of many of our elders who came together during a time when there was a lot of conversation with the Department of Health and Human Services to figure out the best way to address health and well-being for NHPI communities. And so NHPI Alliance came as a result of that, and actually was incubated by the Health Forum for its first several years of existence. Unfortunately, many of our elders have passed on. However, to Kiawan's credit, she has held on to the Alliance since then, and has continued to do work under the radar to continue to uphold the name of the organization, and is going through a phase of revamping and trying to get the work back up, since, with the pandemic, there's obviously a need for advocacy, and there's just a need for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander organizations to exist. And so the Alliance's mission is the NHPI Alliance is dedicated to the advocacy, education, research, and promotion of health and well-being of all Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders within the United States and the U.S. territories. So those are our main, I would say, our main national organizations. Okay, we're going to come all the way to this side of, to this coast. Some of our organizations in the Pacific Northwest. Again, I'm just highlighting some of the organizations that have been really actively doing work around health and making sure that communities are healthy and especially safe during COVID. But there are other organizations that exist that continue to work alongside and with many of these. First is Utopia Washington. Their executive director is Taffy Johnson. And Utopia Washington is formerly Utopia Seattle. And their mission is to provide sacred spaces to strengthen the minds and bodies of QTPIs, queer and trans Pacific Islanders, through community organizing, community care, civic engagement, and cultural stewardship. The other one in Washington, I'm going to come over to this side, is Pacific Islander Community Association of Washington, or PICA Washington. Their executive director is Joseph Saia, and their mission is threefold: is to establish a cultural home, center community power, and further the wellness of communities physically, culturally, socially, and spiritually. Between Joseph and between PICA Washington and Utopia Washington, there was a lot of work that was happening around COVID and supporting the community due to COVID in the Washington area. And there's another organization I want to give a shout out to that's in Washington, Asian Pacific Cultural Center. And I want to uplift APCC because their executive director is Auntie Lua Pritchard, who has been a pillar in the community and somebody that has mentored so many of us over these years and has encouraged and really helped to hold us as we were trying to navigate our ways through community work, and continues to be a staunch advocate for the progress and forward movement of Pacific Islander efforts. Last but not least is an organization in Portland, Oregon. Utopia PDX is, their executive director is Manumalo Alailima, and their mission is to provide sacred spaces to strengthen the minds and bodies of QTPIs, queer and trans Pacific Islanders in the Portland and Vancouver areas through community organizing, political engagement, and cultural stewardship. You can see here that we have two organizations that are part of the Utopia network. There are Utopia chapters across the country that, hold space for QTPIs in the country. So also something to note is Utopia PDX also convenes the Oregon Pacific Islander Coalition, OPIC, which is a coalition of different Pacific Islander organizations in Oregon, where we have, actually in Oregon and Washington, we have really large populations of our Micronesian community. So Marshallese, Chukis, Yapis, Pohnpeian, Koshrayan. There are large communities there, as well as, Samoans, Tongans. There's Fijian communities large there too. So Utopia PDX convenes OPIC to bring together those communities in Oregon. Next is California, and I chose to highlight these two main organizations because they have been kind of the longest standing organizations. The Regional Pacific Islander Task Force is in the Bay Area, and specifically their work serves three different counties, San Mateo, Alameda, and San Francisco counties. The task force is made up of different members, so it's a coalition that is made up of a few main organizations, but also individuals and other smaller organizations. But just to name some of the the main organizations is Taulama for Tongans. Their executive director is Leafa Daumapeau, who's also another elder, respected elder, somebody that has been in community for decades and has been a mentor to many of us that have been in community, as well as the Samoan Community Development Center. Their executive director is Patsy Tito. And then there are a few other folks that are part of the Regional Pacific Islander Task Force, including Manufo, Leainga, Anoa'i, and Gaynor, Siatanga, and then many other smaller organizations that came later. But, there are some key leaders. Miss Nani Wilson have been part of course, Mamadi Uhila from East Palo Alto are some of the older folks that have been around in the community that contributed to building the Regional Pacific Islander Task Force. This task force has co-chairs that lead their work, Taunu Uve'e and Natalie Asun. This is their website, and their mission is to promote and advance cross-system advocacy in the Bay Area for regional collaboration of Pacific Islander community organizations, businesses, and faith communities for inclusive accessibility to impactful and sustainable programming for a healthy and thriving Pacific Islander community. So that's in the Bay Area. And then going down to Southern California, I'm highlighting Pacific Islander Health Partnership, PIP, which is based out of Orange County. And PIP has been around since 2003. It's one of the longer standing organizations in Southern California. PIP has been around and has been part of so many health initiatives over the decades, including WinCart, which was funded by the National Cancer Institute, and produced a lot of work around cancer disparities, specifically for Pacific Islander communities. WinCart stands for Weaving an Islander Network in Cancer Awareness, Research, and Training. And then another project that did a lot of work around cancer disparities that PIP was a part of, along with other organizations that are really no longer active today, such as Guam Communications Network, Tongan Community Service Center, Samoan National Nurses Association. And I'm naming some of these partners because although they're no longer around, a lot of these organizations contributed to building some of the foundation that many of us are continuing to build upon. So I just want to make sure that I recognize them. And PIP's current executive director is Ualani Ho'opai. In fact, Ualani is their first official executive director, but PIP was founded by a couple of our elders, Uncle Ka'ivi Pang, who has passed on, and Auntie Jane Pang, who's still around. But also, these are a couple of some of our fierce elders that have really contributed to so many of us who are continuing to do work that is building upon the foundation and the legacy that many of them built for us. So PIP's mission is to serve Indigenous Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders by educating, advocating, and training leaders and building community capacity for health for Islanders to reduce disparities in cancer, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and other chronic illnesses with special programs for island seniors and youth. And then a couple of other significant states, where we have large populations. One is Utah. I'm highlighting here the National Tongan American Society in Utah, but of course there are so many other organizations in Utah that contribute to taking care of our Pacific Islander community there. The executive director of Utah is Fahina Tavakepasi. Their website is here. You can get more information there. And NTAS's mission is to strengthen the Pacific Islander family by promoting health, education, cultural preservation, and civic engagement. This is one organization in Utah. There are many, as I said before, but also National Tongan American Society has been around also for a long time. And Fahina is also, although she is, her age isn't all the way up there, but she has also, based on her experience, is an elder in the community that has helped to mentor so many of us and has mentored so many other people. And Utah has a Utah Pacific Islander Health Coalition that is made up of many other organizations, and their focus is on health in Pacific Islander community. ANTAS is part of Utah Pacific Islander Health Coalition, and just to name a few other key leaders in Utah, including Jake Fitisemanu and the late Margarita Satini, who have contributed to building a lot of the work there. And of course, there are so many other leaders that have been part of the work, but are doing many other wonderful things in Utah, like Anapesika Ili, so many leaders in Utah. So there's a lot of the work that's happening there around making sure that our community is supported. And then in Arkansas, where you should know by now, because I've mentioned this a few times, where we have our largest Marshallese community, is the Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese. Their executive director is Melissa Lailan, and they have been leading so much of the COVID response work in Arkansas. And also they do the whole range of work to support community, from direct service all the way up to research and data advocacy and policy advocacy. ACOM's mission is, this is an organization that is Marshallese, and it is aspiring for growth through leadership, education, cultural integrity, and commitment to community. And also I want to mention here that we have a large Micronesian community in the Midwest. And so there are other smaller organizations across those states there that are helping to coordinate and organize and address some of the needs of the populations that are spread across the Midwest, that are mainly from our Micronesian community. So I guess that's the last of the organizations that I'm bringing into your attention here. And of course, I didn't talk about some of their specific work because they do so much. And we have a lot of organizations across the country that are, their aim is to serve the community. And I think that, that's not a surprising thing, because as Pacific Islanders, being of service is central to who we are, and especially being part of the collective and serving the collective and being giving to that, right, is part of Pacific Islander cultural values. And so we have a lot of different organizations across the country. We have a lot of entities that have, start up to do, because they identify a need in the community that nobody else is addressing. And so, a group of people get together and start to put strategies together to serve their community. And many of them continue to do work without getting their 501c3. So no matter where you are in the country, you can probably find a Pacific Islander community-based organization that is wherever our populations are, where people just come together to generate solutions and support the community. Of course, we have other states that I didn't get to highlight here, including Alaska, Nevada, Arizona, where we have large populations, but I didn't get to highlight them here. And so I encourage you to, a health forum sometimes has a pretty complete list of Pacific Islander organizations across the country. So I encourage you to reach out to them wherever you're at, see if there's a community around you, if you're looking for partnership. And so the last slide I have here is just some advice around partnerships, around partnering with the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. And I hope that this becomes really useful to you. I also hope that this feels like I'm just repeating something familiar because I've talked about it before. But I compile these 7 key things that I hope that you keep in mind when you are partnering with Pacific Islander organizations. Number 1 thing is meaningful partnerships take time. And so you can expect for it to exist for a month and have it be something where the community is giving you everything that you need. Sometimes that happens. Most times it doesn't happen that way. And so understanding this means that people are prepared to put in the time and allow for it to unfold and for the partnership to strengthen and the connection between organizations or between people to be fostered and grow. So meaningful partnerships take time. Number 2, first things first, observe, learn, listen, and learn. Many times when organizations that are not Pacific Islander establish relationships with Pacific Islander organization, oftentimes people don't take the time to just learn and listen. Many times you can just learn just by listening to a conversation, just by being in the room and hearing how the exchanges are between people, observing what is happening. There's a lot of learning there. And so I would encourage you, upon establishing relationships with Pacific Islander organizations, is to observe as much as you can, listen and learn as much as you can. Number 3, reciprocity is golden. Don't just email, call, or show up when you need something. Show up when you're least needed. Reciprocity is one of our core values. And so part of fostering relationship is just showing up for people, even when it has nothing to do with work. Especially when it has nothing to do with work, but you see that the organization, this is something that's important to the organization. I can say, for example, if an organization has an event and it's not necessarily tied to the reason why you're building a relationship with them, but say they have, they're hosting a health fair. It is really important if you show up to their health fair and offer to volunteer and help out for a couple hours. Or even if you're just going to come and say hi and see how everybody is and just check in. So that kind of like showing face is really important in building relationships. So doing things where you're not expecting anything in return is actually a really good way of establishing and fostering relationship with Pacific Islander organizations. Number 4 is to learn the structure of each community or organization. People are who they are in the community for a reason. And so in every space that you enter, you cannot expect that the structure is the same. Sometimes it might be the same if it's the same culture. Sometimes it's really different across different cultures. And you won't know it until you actually observe and you learn what the structure is. And this is really important because, who you communicate with and who you have exchanges with, or that person's position within the structure determines their function and how useful they would be to the partnership you're fostering. And so being able to identify who plays what role within an organization or within a community is really important to know. And once you know it, it's really important to uphold. And so I put this last part here, people are who they are in community for a reason, mostly for referring to our elders as the best example. A lot of times our elders have been in community for decades, and many times they don't necessarily need to speak up. And so maybe there's an assumption by newer people to the space that maybe the elders don't know as much. But in fact, they know a lot. They just don't say very much because they've done a lot of talking for decades. And so respecting people when you can identify that they have position in the structures can go a long way. Number 5, allow time for consensus building. This was something that I mentioned in the module where I talked about cultural values. Oftentimes consensus building takes time. And so it's tied to the first thing there about meaningful partnerships taking time. And it's really about people feeling like their thoughts and ideas are taken into consideration, and then building trust that way. Number 6, err on the side of asking for permission. If you're ever in doubt about anything, just ask for permission. You always want to ask for permission. One of the key things is that I emphasize to people is sharing people's contact information. You always want to ask for permission first before you share it with anybody. But that's a really simple example. There are many, many different situations in working with Pacific Islander communities where permission is usually one way of activating communication, or indicating that you know how to interact in space is by asking permission. So it's really important to learn. 7, and this is the very last one, is always remember we are the best stewards of the work in and for our community. We know how to do the work better than anybody else for our community. And by anybody else, I mean folks that are not from the community. And so in order for successful partnerships to exist in doing work for the community, there needs to be understanding of that and trust of that. I don't know if there's much more that I need to say about that, but nobody's going to come and love our community more than we will love our community. And so therefore our commitment is to that service of our community and doing it in a way that is just, that is pono, that is righteous to the way our community is. And so we are the best at doing that for our own people. So partnerships can be very successful when you're able to at least observe some of these things and continue to grow it, because partnerships should exist not just for the length of the project, but beyond that, at least when working in our communities. Wow, I can't believe it. So this is the end of the content for Module 6. And no, I'm not doing knowledge checks since it's the last one. And I just want to say thank you for, if you completed this entire learning course, thank you for taking the time to learn about our Pacific Islander community. There are many experts out there from our community who have worked for many, many years. If you have any questions, please reach out to any of them. I hope that you were able to learn from what I've shared here on behalf of our community. Again, I am one person in a single voice, and I cannot assume that I do not speak for everybody's experience. So good luck with everything. Thank you for spending time with me. And I'm going to close out with this quote from Julian Aguon's book. He is a Chamorro poet, lawyer, activist. And this is a quote from his book, The Properties of Perpetual Light. I would recommend this. And this quote comes from him talking about working with Indigenous people. Peoples, and by peoples here, he's talking about Indigenous people. So peoples who have a unique capacity to resist despair through connection to collective memory, and who just might be our best hope to build a new world rooted in reciprocity and mutual respect. for the earth and for each other. The world we need, the world of our dreams. With that, thank you so much for spending time with us. I wish you greatness and abundance, and I hope that I get to see you around in the work. Malo aupito, whakaapapatu o fatu.